Such a positive and inspirational contribution. We have one more speaker, then two discussants. I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, who read about on your short list of biographies. But we're pleased to hear from you, Reverend Peter Colwell, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baroness Cox. Do I need a microphone or something?
I think you're going to...
Oh, it's not sticking, fine. I have actually been passed a note by the chair asking me to kindly limit my comments to 10 minutes, which I'm very happy to do. It reminds me of the clergyman who, in the middle of his sermon, 15 minutes into the sermon, was most unwisely asked a rhetorical question. What more shall I say? And the voice from the back said, "Say amen and sit down." So if I'm going beyond 10 minutes, you might want to say from the back, "Say amen, Peter, and sit down." I was also given a very useful piece of advice by an older minister who's a great mentor to me, that always, when addressing somebody you were meeting for the first time, was doctor. Because he said, if they have a doctorate, they will be flattered that you are aware that they have done doctoral research. If they have not got a doctorate, they'll be still flattered that you think they have done doctoral research. So I look at my biog here and I'm very flattered. So I think I was obviously in Muhammad's mind to write some flattering words about me. I was also quite amused to hear that trustees of the Interfaith Network are extremists. I think I must be the only minister of the United Reformed Church who's ever been accused of being an extremist. I'm not sure that's a compliment or something else. I want to just talk about, I've asked myself a question in preparing for this evening. What is interfaith for, and what is it supposed to be there to achieve? And as I reflect on that, I want to share something really of the story of the Christian churches in interfaith dialogue, and this in the context of this conversation. And in one sense, that journey is also a personal journey, because for me, my involvement in interfaith dialogue has been both a Christian ecumenical one, which is where it began, my encounter with Christians of different traditions, which led me to encounter the religious other. And I think the most powerful thing in that journey for me was listening to the reflections of two Sikh people who had been observers to the World Council of Churches Assembly in Harare. And it was their observations from a Sikh perspective on how Christianity in the world is at that point so moved me that I knew that I had to be involved in interfaith dialogue. And that's really where we begin. The Christian involvement in interfaith dialogue emerges out of the ecumenical Christian encounter, where the churches recognised that in the post-World War II context, the post-Holocaust context, reconciliation, peace-building, and quite a lot of humility was the single most crucial issues that the churches in the Western world had to embrace. It had to take responsibility for its own involvement in the divisions of Europe and of the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. Now, other faiths will have their own reasons for being involved in interfaith dialogue. What I want to share with you is just a brief glance backwards as to why the churches have done so. In a structured and intentional way, it is really in the 1970s that in Britain, building on the work of the World Council of Churches, that dialogue between different faiths and ideologies started to emerge as a major theme. It's important to stress this faiths and ideologies because it reminds us of the context of that. It was a Cold War period, and it wasn't just other faiths that we felt obliged to be in dialogue with. Now, this began really with the British Council of Churches, which is the predecessor body to the body I work for now, the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, which commissioned work on how the churches should respond to the relatively newly arrived Muslim communities in Britain in the 1970s. And that led to the presence of the Islam Advisory Group in 1974 and the publishing of Christian Responsibility Towards Those of Other Faiths and Ideologies in 1977. Then there was the creation of the Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths, and then the Church's Commission for Interfaith Relations. Now, it's out of those two bodies that there was felt the need that the churches, rather than talking to each other about how we engage with Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews and others, that actually there should be a multilateral forum. And bodies like the Interfaith Network grew out of that work. But all this happened at a time when interfaith dialogue was seen to be a bit niche and slightly eccentric. There was great suspicion in the churches, and indeed I'm sure in many communities, that this might lead towards compromise and even syncretism. Now, I just returned from the World Council of Churches Assembly in South Korea, and there was a huge Christian demonstration outside the Assembly for the whole 2 weeks, protesting about the World Council of Churches and the way in which it dialogues with people of other faiths and promotes rights for gay and lesbian people. So clearly that view that it's about syncretism is still very much around. But I think for us in Britain, what changed was the post-9/11 context, when we found ourselves with a government response to the terrible events in New York, some might say a panic response, into taking measures to protect its own citizens. Amidst wars in the Middle East and counter-terrorism measures, there arose the view that interfaith dialogue might help prevent communities leading separate lives that would otherwise provide fertile ground for what was called the radicalised preachers of hate. And so interfaith dialogue came in from the cold, flattering many people and organisations that they could actually make an impact in changing the way the world was, and indeed how religion was religion's place within the world. Now, today, we might, with hindsight, look back with some degree of humour at the idea that an interfaith vigil, followed by a cup of tea and some delicious samosas, was going to change anything, or was likely to make anyone less likely to commit a terrorist atrocity. We may well think is absolutely ludicrous. But at the time, people thought quite genuinely that they were doing something important. But often, as with so many of these things, what you end up doing is making common cause with people of like mind. And so interfaith became mainstreamed, and many churches, other faith bodies, organisations wanted to engage and be associated with it. Was it well-intentioned? Was it motivated by the best of intentions? I would suggest that on the whole it was, but we may well have reached the point where we want to ask ourselves the question, have what we've done over the last 10 years, has it been the right thing to do? Was there aspects of it that were wrong-headed, misguided, or plain naive? But it is in the nature, I would suggest, of interfaith dialogue to take risks, to engage with the religious and philosophical other, because it is through those risks that we grow as people and grow as people of faith. And we also give ourselves the opportunity to deepen our understanding of one another. And it is, I believe, in keeping with what the early pioneers of interfaith dialogue really were about. Now, just to conclude, I want to say that a number of faith organisations and interfaith bodies are conscious that we are now living in a very different world than we were in the post-war and even the post-9/11 world. So we recognise, I think, or I would suggest, that we do need to change the way we do interfaith relations. And in particular, we need to recognise that people do not, if ever they did, fit into neat categories of faith where we can speak of what a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or a Muslim or a Sikh believes or thinks. The equal marriage debate illustrated that point quite well, that there is a diversity of opinion within religions as well as between them. It is healthy to recognise that religions are diverse coalitions of people who often disagree passionately within their religion, and it's no bad thing to acknowledge this. Perhaps in the past we have levelled out the differences for fear of appearing divided in the face of the religious other. Do I, as a Christian, am I embarrassed about that I disagree with other Christians in the face of my Muslim colleagues? And I think there's been a bit of that around. 2 further points, and then I will sit down. The second point I want to make is that we need to recognise the almost unlimited diversity of religious and spiritual belonging that interfaith leads us to think that interfaith dialogue needs to be much more open and more willing to take risks with each other. In the past, there has perhaps been a little too much restrictive practice, however well-intentioned at the time. And finally, we need to recognise social realities, that most people in Britain today are not involved with organised religion, even if they claim to belong to a religion. And therefore, the secular dimension to our contemporary life means that secularism in all its forms and different meanings is one of the most creative and sometimes most destructive aspects of our society, but one that needs to be engaged with through dialogue. So, has interfaith dialogue gone wrong, to ask the question? I don't believe it has, but certainly we do need perhaps to recalibrate the compass for the 21st century.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know of no one who's more effective at recalibrating compasses than Douglas Murray. Douglas, you are first of our discussants. Thank you very much. We look forward. You have got a lot to take on board and discuss. And then after Douglas, I think, is that right?
Sure.
We have got 2 splendid discussants, both wonderful at recalibrating compasses. But it said on the programme, I think, Douglas Murray and then Sheikh Mohammed.
I'm happy to do that. Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. I'll respond briefly to some of the points and make a couple of points I was intending to make. And since I'm a discussant, I'll stay seated if that's okay. Firstly, I come at this from a slightly different point, I think, from some of the previous speakers, and I do think it's always worth asking the question: what is the point of interfaith dialogue? What is really the point of it? It seems to me, at any rate, not very much. It's always worthwhile to sit down with people who you haven't sat down with before. I think it's always vital that people reach across lines, if there are lines that are drawn and differences which exist which otherwise may not be able to be circumvented. But there is a serious question mark over the whole procedure of interfaith dialogue. In my observation of it over the years, it seems to me that the outcome of most intense meetings are that Christians and Muslims agree on the experience of the historical Jesus, and Muslims and Jews agree on certain dietary laws, and everyone feels that something's been accomplished, when not really very much has, because the nature of interfaith dialogue is that you can't possibly agree on the main things, because the main things are the things that make religions different, and you can't possibly agree with those differences, or you're going to have to join that other religion. It's a fundamental problem at the outset, and the reason I mention that is because although I may have just somewhat caricatured it in my comments on dietary laws and so on, there is a serious problem here. A desire to avoid all of the main differences, all of the main and often very painful issues of difference and focus on the bits that are effectively sort of soft and around the edges and so on. Now, this country, to an extent in recent years, in particular, as Peter said, I think in the post-9/11 period, has lost some of the confidence to talk about the Christian faith or a national faith, and replaced it instead with a sort of faiths generally, or the idea that faith itself is in and of itself a good thing. And again, I think that's certainly contestable, and is certainly contested by the very large number of people in this country who don't have any faith. But we now have, of course, a future king who says he wants to be the defender of faiths, and we have even a minister of faith. Why I think you need an extra minister to represent people like that, I don't yet know, but maybe somebody will point out. I think that the reason we're discussing this is obviously a reason why this has been such a febrile issue over recent years is obviously because of the question of so-called Muslim representation. I think that Muslims have been the first people to have been let down by this. I ought to stress that at the outset. The government in this country, successive governments of all political stripes, I'm not a party political person, I'm not making a party political point. It seems to me that government representatives of all stripes in recent years have made a very serious mistake, and it has in part been driven by the soft bigotry of low expectation. Because in this country Muslim groups organised the most clearly, actively and visibly after the Rushdie affair, it has been the case, and I think is demonstrably, provably the case, that since the Rushdie affair, the loudest and to some extent the most vociferous and to some extent the more unpleasant voices have been the voices which have predominated in the discussion. And that as a result, government ministers and others have thought, well, maybe those are the Muslims. I think they've made a great mistake in doing so, but I think that is one of the driving forces behind it. I think of that thing that, the famous comment that Henry Kissinger said about Europe, what number do I dial to get Europe? To an extent, in recent years, governments have thought, and again, successive governments of all stripes, what number do I dial to get the Muslims? What number do I dial? And it goes for other faiths as well. What number do I dial to get the Jews? And one of the starting points, it would seem to me, is to say there is no number. There is no spokesperson. There is no overarching person. You approach Muslims, Jews, anyone else in exactly the same way you approach everyone else, as citizens, as equal citizens, and there's nothing more and nothing less. A few years ago, when I was doing some interviews for a piece on Sharia councils, which have started cropping up, I was speaking to a woman in Birmingham, a Muslim woman. I never forget what she said. She said, I was born in this country, I'm a Muslim, I was born British, and she said, all my life I've been told what my rights are as a Muslim woman, and nobody's ever said what my rights are as a British woman. And I think that this diverting people up, divisioning people up into different groups on top of being citizens is a real problem. And I know that it's a problem for other communities because I have people of all other faiths saying to me how irritated they are by people holding themselves out as communal representatives or spokespeople when they say, I never voted for this person, I never met this person, they've never spoken for me. How are these people represented? As I say, in the same way that everyone else is represented. If somebody said, who is the Muslim representative? It's the same as everyone else. It's Muslim MPs who happen to have a Muslim faith. Just as if somebody says, who might speak for other minority communities, people who are elected and who may use their elected voice to do so. I think putting this extra layer of unelected, unaccountable people on top of our society, and on top, indeed, at times of electoral politics, is a recipe which, even if it weren't a disaster now, will be a disaster at some point down the road. I would argue will repeatedly be a disaster. A certain type of person holds themselves out as a spokespeople for people who have never elected them. Another type of person puts themselves forward for election. It is the second type, I would submit, who we should be encouraging. Thirdly, a broad point, to come back to pretty much where I started about this issue of not being able to address the key points. Khalil talked about the role of religion in violence, and I respectfully disagree. I think at the very least one can agree that interfaith dialogue is deemed to be of any use, so should interfaith to non-faith dialogue. And one of the premises from which one ought to be able to at least start is to say that just as people of faith can do very bad things, so people of no faith at all can do very bad things. And just as people of faith can do very good things, so can people of no faith at all. But to engage in the game of secularists are responsible for genocide, religious people are not, is as ridiculous in its own way as those who would claim that religions are responsible for all evil and secularism is responsible for none. I don't think it's a helpful place to start. And as for the issue of good verses and bad verses, we get back to a key issue. Again, one of those ones that will be and is, I think, often avoided, is that every monotheism and others have very bad verses in their holy books. And in my experience in recent years debating these issues endlessly, and you just did another one now about there being no compulsion in religion, quoting out of context is quoting a bad verse. Quoting in context is quoting a good verse. I was actually once on a panel at the European Parliament with a Danish so-called Muslim leader who quoted a good verse, so-called good verse from the Quran. I said, would you mind finishing off that verse? Would you mind explaining where that verse goes? And he said, you are quoting out of context. I said, I'm giving the context for the quote you quoted out of context. But look, and of course it goes out saying, again, it can't be said enough. That is your interpretation of Islam. I'm delighted. I also wish very deeply that this were the interpretation that were globally predominant. It must not be avoided. It is not predominant, and that is a real problem. It is a real and considerable problem for government here, as well as citizens and individuals of all faiths and none, that globally the most moderate voices of Islam are simply not the most powerful. And that if one looks around the world, the fact that the Khomeinists still run the most important Shia state in the world, and that the House of Saud has dominance over the most significant Sunni, and that all types of others do all sorts of appalling things to their citizens and wish to pump the same sort of hatreds here, simply can't go unmentioned. It's a problem. It's a deep problem within Islam. And it seems to me that the attitudes of non-Muslims to it is very important. And I would say it should simply be this: to say we recognise this is a deep struggle that has been going on for a very long time, which Ahmadiyya and others are on the very, very forefront of suffering over, and that we wish you luck and wish the better interpretations and the better people to win, but that we cannot tie our own future or our own freedoms of speech and observation to that battle, because it is possible that it'll be one that is lost. And why I started this chain of thought was simply to point out, as I say, what the rest of us can do, apart from wishing luck. Whatever it is, I would say there are two things that are most important. One is, just to recap, treating people as citizens, not as believers, trying to unite people among what genuinely we have in common as citizens and not what we have as differences as believers or non-believers. And secondly, if there must be, and I don't think it should be, but if there must be something that goes on, which I would stress should not be state-funded or taxpayer-funded at all, if there must be a form of dialogue simply to plead with all those people of other religions, Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, Sikh leaders, and all others, to be more careful about the people you select to dialogue with. Peter's comment about post-Holocaust understanding of the importance of religious dialogue is, I think, extremely pertinent, extremely well taken, at any rate, by, I think, most people in this room. But I don't think it's possible to start from considering that and not wonder how it is that in 2013, and for the last 20 years and more, one of the people in Britain most connected with this very post-Holocaust interfaith dialogue could be somebody now convicted in Bangladesh of the most appalling genocide of the late 20th century. Convicted, albeit with caveats and in absentia, but convicted of the most horrific crimes, of selecting intellectuals, of scientists, of academics and journalists and others, selecting them and killing them in the most brutal fashion. Now, I don't say that everyone with whom such a person has dialogued should have known everything about that person's past, or could necessarily have done anything about it. But it seems to me hugely remiss, at the very least, that a piece of knowledge which has been known for 20 years at least, which Channel 4 exposed in the 1990s, should have been of so apparently little concern to so many people in this country. Therein lies, I think, a deep shame, and it is one that I suggest is part of an endemic problem, and not a specific one which, if we simply solve this time, can be solved forever. But thank you very much.
Thank you. That was characteristically robust and thought-provoking and very, very significant. Thank you. My pleasure now to introduce the last of our speakers before we open up for Q&A. Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al-Hussaini, thank you. And say a special thank you to you for so much work you've done in bringing us all together here this evening. So it is a great pleasure indeed to ask you if you'd like to act as a discussant for us.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Assalamu alaikum, shalom alaikum. Peace be with you all. Thank you very much, Caroline, for your generous words and kind introduction, and for hosting this occasion. I look around the room, I see some very loved and beloved friends and faces from all my sister traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslims, minority faiths, all together. And among this gathering are people who have experienced in their speaking truth to power, a huge amount of sacrifice. One thing that my dear mate Sam is too modest to say is that as a result of his courage in speaking out through this report, raising issues of truth, he's experienced some real difficulties, and I hope we can all club together and support him in these times. I want to honour these friends, these mates of mine, Christians, Jews, humanists, minority faiths. I want to honour them, all of you. And to say that the true meaning of interfaith is when we as citizens, Douglas, as we as citizens stand together regardless of our differences of religion or taste in music or football team, and speak truth to protect the most vulnerable among us. And Caroline's track record on this is, of course, impeccable. There's not time. I was going to sing you a song, actually, but there's not time. And so in this particular gathering, I just want to honour, alongside my friends, instead of a spiritual reflection, I want to honour people who aren't in this room. I want to honour the Christian victims of religious persecution in the Middle East at the moment, as we see churches going up in flames, and I know Peter's been very much involved in trying to do something about this, as indeed Baroness Cox has. I want us to all be attentive at a time of rising Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, to not forget the legacy of the Shoah, an unprecedented genocide, unlike any other. And in the light of this issue that has been raised in the news in recent days, to particularly bear in mind one Muslim genocide, which is that genocide of 3 million Muslim Bangladeshis and also non-Muslims in Bangladesh. So I'm going to start. I'm going to get into it. And I say at the outset, there are things that need saying, because a lot of people have got hurt, including friends of mine, and it would be wrong not to take this opportunity to speak truth into this situation. And I say, in the words of our Holy Scripture, "A'tasimu bihablillahi jami'an," hold fast, all of you, to the rope of God. "Wa la tafarraqu," and be not divided among yourselves. And remember, with gratitude, God's favour upon you, for you are enemies, and he joined your hearts in love, so that by his grace you became brethren, and we stand together as brethren in this enterprise. There's a different quote. It's called, it says, "Kill 3 million of them, and the rest will eat out of our hands." These are the words of Yahya Khan, the president of West Pakistan during the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. I note my colleague, Brother Ansar Ahmedullah, is here. who's been working on war criminality in relation to the Bangladesh genocide. And rather than go on at length, I hope during the discussion we will be able to hear his expert testimony of what happened. But essentially, in conjunction with an organisation called Jamaat-e-Islami, which has branches here in the UK, the Al-Badr death squads assisted in the torture and killing of Muslim children, the bombing and demolition of Bengali Islamic mosques, shrines, Islamic holy places, including the desecration of sacred Islamic scriptures within them. And during the course of the war, some 450,000 Bengali women, mainly Muslim women, were seized, disrobed, dishonoured, raped by the Pakistan army, and the Islamist Jamaat-e-Islami militia often raped to death or kept as sex slaves, and so on. While, of course, unscrupulously and without any let or hindrance desecrating holy places of Islam, as Islamists are wont to do all the time, the brunt of this viciousness was borne by the Hindu and Christian minority communities. There's a human story here. Urmi was a young Hindu girl whose father was the caretaker at Dhaka University the night that the West Pakistan army, together with the militia of the Jamaat-e-Islami al-Badr death squads, attacked the student dorms, eliminating the intelligentsia, as it were. They seized Urmi by the foot, dragged her across the ground to the place where the Pakistani army would violate her and later dispose of her body. My dear friend, Christian academic friend, Dr. David Coffey from the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies in Oxford, who they established a Bible college in Dhaka, tells of how the girls at that seminary leapt to their deaths from the roof of the building to avoid the inevitable fate that would otherwise befall them. We heard from Sam, from Douglas, about Chowdhury Moinuddin. I won't reiterate those points, other than to say that my Bangladeshi colleagues speak of London as our Argentina for our Nazis, where these individuals established Jamaat-e-Islami organisations and have been prominent in interreligious dialogue. As outlined on page 25 and 26 of Sam's Interfaith report, on the 10th of May 2013, this year, a multi-faith, an interfaith, a multi-faith letter with Christian, Muslim, many Muslim signatories, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists, wrote an open letter to the President of the Board of Deputies, Vivian Weinman, then the Jewish Vice Chair, now the Jewish Co-Chair of the Interfaith Network for the United Kingdom, raising clear concerns as to why there was a Jewish Muslim established so-called National Council of Imams and Rabbis that met at the East London Mosque that had been taken over in the 1980s by Jamaat. And calling for concerns to be raised as to why one of the leading figures on that National Council for Imams and Rabbis was also a signatory to the Jew-hating Istanbul Declaration. This council has the official written imprimatur published on the Joseph Interfaith Foundation's website of Farooq Murad, also closely linked to Jamaat, of the Muslim Council of Britain. And you can see the appointment of Mary Nicknam, the director of the Joseph Interfaith Foundation, as an advisor, signed by Manazir Ahsan, who Sam mentioned, head of the Islamic Foundation. There was no response from Mr. Weinman. We have invited the Interfaith Network to send officially Jewish and Muslim representatives to attend the meeting today. I rather think, like Eliyahu Hanavi, we should open the door and wait for him to come. We're waiting for you, Vivian, and we rather wonder why you aren't here to answer the Jewish public that are waiting here to ask questions to you. Just a few days ago, I received an invitation from a very nice chap who is making an Arabic language film on Jewish-Muslim dialogue to use Arabic speakers, to explain the importance of interfaith dialogue. Since Jewish-Muslim stuff is right up my street, I would have been delighted to participate. until I saw on the documentary description that this is being sponsored by King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz's International Centre for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue in Vienna, which exists, quote, to promote the goals of human rights and religious freedom, justice, peace and reconciliation, plus acting against the abuse of religion as a mean to justify oppression, violence and conflict, promoting abiding societal cherishment for the preservation and sacredness of holy sites. That last bit really made me laugh, having been to Mecca. Such human rights and religious freedoms are, of course, completely illegal in Saudi Arabia. And whereas I had to decline quite naturally, there are both Jewish and Christian collaborators at senior levels of this project. In Arabic, we speak of Al-Hussaini, father of two tongues. And my question is, how did we get into this mess? You know, we are people of faith. You know, I've grown up with Christian and Jewish colleagues. We have lovely friends and colleagues who are standing in solidarity with one another in support of that which is just, to defend the most vulnerable. How did we get to this place where the meeting of ordinary people in deep fear of God ended up a rotten and corrupt, monetized, politicized interfaith industry, manifest in groups with the greatest respect, manifest in groups such as some of the politics in the interfaith network, which to my mind, if you'll pardon me for saying, has absolutely nothing to do with interfaith dialogue at all. And this insatiable greed by religious politicians, as Douglas has noted, for unelected power and political influence, where does it come from? To understand this point, you have to understand the point that I don't blame the Islamists at all. It isn't the Islamists' fault at all. It really, really isn't. They didn't build the interfaith industry that has now hijacked, co-opted, kidnapped genuine interfaith dialogue. They would have never had the intellect to do so. The Islamist extremists are absolutely not to blame. The Islamist extremists are simply doing their job. They are doing what they do. They are buying non-Muslims. They are buying non-Muslims who are willing and eager to be bought. The focus of my discussion today is therefore not going to mention a single Muslim, because to blame is for this monetized political culture and this culture of gatekeeping. Every single one of those leading interfaith leaders are Christian or in certain cases Jewish. So who are the kind of people leading interfaith dialogue in this country in leading positions alongside all the good people? Well, I'm rather cool to recollect the words of St. Anselm to St. Abelard, nondum considerasti, quanti ponderus sit peccatum, you have not considered the full weight, the full burden of human sin. With all due respect, we start in enterprises with the very best of intentions, but our human nature, in certain cases, might be predisposed to take us in a very different direction. Several years ago, and this is where the personal aspect comes to it, because it's my friends we're talking about here, my friends. Several years ago, a very dear friend of mine, a very fine Christian theologian and scholar of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, actually, another person who stood up against religious establishment, was attending the interview for his internal promotion at Birmingham University Department of Theology. At the interview, one of the interviewers approached him afterwards and told him, to his shock and horror, that the panel had received an external communication from a man called Professor David Ford, who is the head of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, one of the most prominent and indeed wealthiest interreligious organisations in the country. Ford applying this improper influence on an academic panel at an academic institution, not to promote, against promoting my friend. Ford was not at Birmingham at the time. He had no moral right to make such an irregular intervention. After years of ruthless bullying and academic politics, my Christian theologian friend has now had to leave the environment of UK theology, which is now dominated by the Regius Professor at Cambridge, and my friend is now a principal in an Anglican theological college overseas. Since the 90s, Ford has been one of the leading lights of a practice which I'm very attached to, called scriptural reasoning, the shared study by Jews, Christians, and Muslims of their sacred texts, something which, of course, in principle is a sacred, holy, and wonderful thing that has been going on for centuries, not invented by anybody. However, since the 90s, scriptural reasoning as practiced at the American Academy of Religions has been heavily criticized by scholars for its lack of academic integrity, its lack of space for free discourse and disagreement, its controlling, its gatekeeping, its imperialist culture. And this, of course, was long before I ever got involved or even heard of scriptural reasoning. Another very, very dear Christian theologian colleague of mine from Ontario, Canada, experienced years of academic difficulty and pressure after he publicly raised concerns about the direction of scriptural reasoning. And he reports how notoriously at one meeting, Ford, alongside one of the colleagues who speaks with Ford, it was spoken about the need to have the right kind of Muslims to handpick. The same old interfaith gatekeeping we know so very well. Over the course of a number of years, very senior academics have been kicked out by this controlled scriptural reasoning empire. Senior SR figures like Robert Cathy, professor at McCormick Theological Seminary. And instead, this practice of sanctity and of scholarship has become increasingly about the imperial ambitions of somebody who has attracted severe criticism from senior academics at the University of Cambridge, and more widely on the UK theology scene has come into conflict with theology professors and blocking and all that kind of thing at Nottingham and elsewhere, from Nottingham and elsewhere, these other professors who have experienced difficulty. This practice and this program unscrupulously takes vast amounts of money from Middle Eastern dictators, such as the absolute monarchy of the Sultan of Oman, whose human rights record is pretty shocking, actually. It's a Middle Eastern apartheid state, not the other state that people accuse of being an apartheid state. It's a Middle Eastern apartheid state in which the descendants of African slaves and servant tribes who are considered to be of non-Arab blood are the objects of widespread discrimination. And Freedom House in 2005 noted that the Constitution, the Basic Law, does not apply or protect non-citizens from discrimination, meaning that about a quarter of Omani residents are left without any legal protection at all. Nadine Houri of Human Rights Watch notes, rather than listening to legitimate demands and peaceful criticism, Omani authorities are jailing people who speak out. And Frontline Defenders talks of ongoing judicial harassment. My own experience of this monetized, politicized, gate-kept form of interreligious dialogue was my experience down in London at St Ethelburga's Centre, a bit of a church plant of the scriptural reasoning empire, and it was led by a vicar there called William Campbell Taylor. Of course, charmed by this wonderful practice, which they spoke of as being a form of friendship. And I'd never before, being in a secular medical science career, I'd never experienced the crossover between the professional and the personal. Like most people, most British people, I keep my work people at work, and I don't let them into my personal life. And here I found sort of people actually wanting to befriend you. I gave my time, and of course did it with tremendous faith in the idea of interfaith as an absolute good, and as a matter of natural friendship, only to find that stuff that you do as a gift for the sake of God was actually being used by St Ethelburga's to file an application for thousands of pounds of public money behind my back, citing my work, other people's work, without our permission, and I only found out about it when people leaked this information. It's said in our traditional teaching that you cannot use money that has been obtained through dishonest or improper means in apposition to sacred texts. You can have the money, you can drink it, you can smoke it, you can have your tea and samosas, but you cannot do anything sacred that is answerable to God. Recently, this money was used by Ford to try and control the access or the invitation list by Israeli colleagues to a conference that I go to every year in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the poor fellow doesn't understand that Israelis don't appreciate being told by some guy in England who they can and can't invite. And so a bit of an own goal, David. For all his activities and all the hurt that he has caused to all these Christian academic scholars and people of other faiths, David Ford was awarded a gold medal and an OBE for his contribution to interfaith dialogue. Harriet Crabtree is another Christian and the director of the Interfaith Network for the United Kingdom. We've heard about this. As outlined on page 27 of Sam's report, over the last year, the IFN has experienced a major challenge in relation to 25 years of unlawful religious discrimination, which it has perpetrated in excluding Ahmadiyas and members of Druid pagan minority faiths. The report details how instead of taking a moral stance, for 25 years, Harriet Crabtree, Brian Pearce, the Interfaith Network's position, has put simply, was to threaten that major faiths would leave if we allow these communities in. In other words, if we allow black people into our neighbourhood, the white people will move out. A prominent human rights firm, Bindmans, led by its partner John Halford, drew up an legal document explaining why this is completely unlawful under the Equality Act 2010. And yet, on the 12th of July 2012, at the annual general meeting of the IFN, Harriet Crabtree deliberately and knowingly withheld from the AGM a number of documents from several member organisations of the IFN, these being formal resolutions of those member bodies expressing concern about this discriminatory membership policy, expressions of concern by officers about this discrimination. These documents, which were withheld, we published in the public domain because it's important that we do so. Instead, it was misrepresented that instead of it being a wider concern, only two individuals apparently, my colleague Phil Ryder and myself, had raised these concerns. In any other charity, in any other area of public discourse, such an officer would have been obliged to consider their position. There is much more to say, but there's not time to say it, and I hope we can continue in this discussion. All I can say is it's all completely true. If you want to sue me, sue me. Don't sue any of these guys. Sue me, except that you can't, because it is actually all completely true. I want to conclude. In Arabic, we say "Ma Rabb wali." There is no God above them. These people have no recognition of the sight of God over what they do. But I swear, I really do, that they can do whatever they like to me. I'm a bad guy. You can do whatever you like to me. But you will not harm my friends. And also I know that he sees. And he also sees the chief rabbi, and he sees the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he sees the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster. He sees all the heads of the free churches. He sees you all. And he sees your nice international conferences with Gulf leaders where you turn a blind eye to the iniquity of Christian persecution around you. He sees those nice, sweet girls at the Cambridge Interfaith Programme with their nice, sweet scriptural reasoning meetings, turning a blind eye to the hurt done by its director to my poor Christian and non-Christian academic friends. And most of all, he sees those whom you people in the interfaith industry refuse to see. He sees those mourning poor people in faraway lands, mourning loved ones who have been victims of the rich and powerful and unscrupulous, authors of oppression and genocide, with whom you in the interfaith industry collude and from whom you take money. Matthew chapter 7, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power, interfaith dialogue in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers. I want to dedicate my comments today to my brother and my friend William Campbell Taylor for everything that he's done to me through scriptural reasoning at Snethelberger's. But bruv, I love you, mate, and I forgive you. But in that forgiveness and in that fraternal affection, I call you likewise to repent and to look into your heart now as you now make films, interfaith dialogue initiatives and films preaching financial probity to others, condemning the City of London and saying that the Church of England and religious leaders are good. I want you to see and not turn a blind eye to such religious iniquity, because there was a certain man, a rabbi from Galilee, a thorn in the flesh of his religious establishment, and he never turned a blind eye to anyone. To my friends and many faiths and cultures, may God bless you and lift you up for your integrity and courage. And may God bless you all. Thank you.